I'm Jonathan Lee. I'm the headmaster of Ridley, and it's my 7th year here, and it's my pleasure to introduce proceedings tonight. I don't think I ever remember at Ridley, and there have been a number of amazing occasions here before, but such an august collection of authors and presenters as we've got on stage tonight.
We are your conference organizers, Shelley Thomas
and Colin Brzezicki.
We welcome all the CITE members and executives, presenters, and Ridley students, and we are pleased to welcome the members of the public who have come here tonight to listen to our distinguished authors read from their latest works and take part in a critical discussion about the future of books.
To read or not to read, that is the question.
Whether 'tis nobler for the mind to suffer the paper cuts and dog ears of outrageous page counts,
or to take arms against a sea of podcasts and tweets, and by opposing, end them.
for the printed word to die, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end the headache and embrace the 140 characters that Twitter is aired through.
'Tis a contemplation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to screen. Aye, there's the rub. For in that screen of pixels,
What new literacies may come when we have shuffled in this portal coil? Must give us pause.
there's the respect that makes calamity of unending shelf life. In the year that has passed since the revived CITE conference at Ridley College last April, the future of publishing, of writing, and of the very act of reading itself has been the subject of hot debate. In a year when we are told Canadians bought more books than ever before, the traditional publisher and bookseller are under siege. Can they last much longer? Is the question burning at close to 451 degrees Fahrenheit. Is the printed book dead, or is it simply late for its own funeral? And is reading itself threatened in what one columnist recently described as a world where attention is being devalued through the progressive commercialization of human consciousness? This is the subject of our panel discussion this evening, which will be chaired by Derek Finkel and Ian Brown.
Our conference celebrates good reading, good writing, and good teaching. In England recently, the Brown Report on Higher Education explicitly equates the value of a course with the future earnings potential value of the students who take it. That is the common chord in a pedagogical symphony that plays across North America as well. The counterpoint, as always, is provided by the liberal arts, the teachers of art, music, history, philosophy, and of course, English. Our plenary speaker tomorrow is Ian Brown, most recently author of The Boy in the Moon, who will address the subject of the liberal arts in education and provide a keynote in our Writing Off-Key conference. Welcome, Ian.
We also welcome renowned and award-winning novelists tonight who will take part in the panel discussion, but who will first remind us of what is at stake as they read from their most recently published work. We welcome Linden MacIntyre, Katrina Onstad, Russell Smith, and Richard B. Wright.
I won't tell you too much about the book, other than the fact that it's about a priest who has an unusual job for unusual reasons, and his job is to suppress scandal that has the potential to undermine the authority of the church of which he is a part. And the scandals that are beginning to break out have to do with sexual abuse of children. The book's been out for a couple of years. Maybe you heard about it. And he has two immediate challenges. One is to go to the families that are threatening to create the scandal because something has happened, and to reassure them and settle them down. And then, having done that, and it's usually not as difficult as you would imagine, because priests, as I often point out, who abuse children don't usually abuse the children of Jewish families. They abuse the children of the most devout Catholic families, and the families want to be reassured. And the other thing they then do, or Father Duncan would do, is then he would go and confront the abuser. And then they would take the action from there as it was deemed appropriate. So I just want to read a little scene where he actually does his work within a family that has been threatening to make a fuss about something that happened to one of the boys. There was a dreary sameness to the scenes. The rooms all seemed to smell and look alike, potpourri or carpet cleaner or both. Pastel colors, sturdy furniture probably bought from one of the pay-when-you-feel-like-it merchants shouting out of their oversized TV sets, Swedish wood stoves, rooms overheated, long silences. At first I was confused by the tension, which I finally attributed to embarrassment on the part of what we were calling the victims. In spite of how much I've learned since then, I still wonder about that word, victim. What does it really represent? Uncertainty? Guilt? Victims of whom? The predator? Their weaker selves? What complex web of circumstances does that prophylactic word conceal? That isn't your job, the bishop said. Circumstances, they're for cops and lawyers. We have to settle these things before that crowd get involved. What if they want money? We'll deal with that if it arises. The wife had a doctor's appointment, the man said, handing me a mug of coffee. She's been on medication since this shit came up. He sat opposite me, a low table between us. There was a large art book beside a red glass ashtray. You remember the obscure details. They buffer all the odious realities. He was a businessman. The jeans he was wearing looked stiff and new, yet unwashed. My formal suit, my collar, meant nothing to him now. The circumstances made us equals. The boy is in school. I thought we should talk this over man to man. Yes, but I should meet him. You will. He'll be home in an hour or so. How was the drive down? It was a 2-hour drive, but it took me 3. By then I'd developed an aversion to these trips. I had stopped at a little restaurant and lingered over tea for as long as I could endure the glances and the stares drawn by my black suit, my Roman collar. This is hard to talk about, the man said, but let's cut to the chase. I want that man out of here toot sweet. I don't care where he goes, but I want him out of here, preferably out of the church entirely. I understand, I said. If he was anything but an effing priest, I'd shoot him, if you'll pardon my language. The contempt in his expression was all-inclusive. I'm going to tell you right up straight, and I don't want you to take this personally, but just looking at you sitting there gives me a problem. That's what he's done. That's what he's done to me, for God's sake. I don't even want to think about what the young fellow and how he feels. He waved a futile hand in my direction and then looked away. The collar. Christ, I was an altar boy myself. That collar meant something. It carried more authority than a badge. Now I could just rip it off of you. Well, if it would help, No, don't, Christ, don't do that. I'm sorry. It was by then a familiar story. Devout family, boys on the altar, excursions, no suspicion of anything. Then a personality change. The boy seems withdrawn, uncommunicative, showing signs of rebellion. They think it's growing pains at first. Then they find pot or pills, and it explains everything for a while. They read how excessive use of cannabis makes them moody, causes school performance to suffer. There is a confrontation, eventually the tearful, heart-stopping allegation. I imagine it's like getting shot, the father said. My dad was in the war. He got hit in France a few days after D-Day. Said you don't feel a thing at first. The pain comes later, gradually. I said I understood. Thank Christ he isn't around for this, he sighed. Dad was from the old school. I sipped my coffee, waiting. They have to get it out. The thing that gets me is that I used to hear about this kind of stuff and I'd always minimize it. Isolated situation, I'd say. A bad apple in every barrel. Or you'd hear about a case that went on for years, and I'd ask myself, How can someone be a victim for years, repeatedly, over and over again? Why don't they stop it? They must in some way be complicit. That's what you're thinking. You forget they're only kids, dealing with the ultimate in moral authority. He seemed to pause and to pull back from the brink of bitterness. He shook his head. Then it happens to yourself, right in your own family. You weren't exactly wrong when you thought it was a matter of isolated incidents. I have to assure you that this... Whoa, he interrupted, his face flushed as he raised a cautionary hand. We're both grown-ups. Let's not bullshit each other. I've been following what's going on. Newfoundland, down in the States, what the Indians are saying about those schools. He got up then, and he took my mug to the coffee pot, and he refilled it. The angry spasm seemed to pass. He's such a good boy, he said, shaking his head slowly. From the day he was born, you just knew that this was one of the special kids. Sweet-natured, smart, spiritual in a way that you don't often see in little boys. I could sense the returning outrage. He lit a cigarette, tapping off the ashes even before they formed. This was the last thing I expected. You're ready for the little fender benders and the mood swings and the booze and the pot. I mean, it isn't so long since I was young myself. And we went through it all before with his older brother. I thought he was haywire. I mean, the booze thing, even dope. But nothing like this. Tactical opportunity. And where is he now? Who? Your older boy. Oh, he's at St. Mary's. Maybe you heard of him. He's on the football team. Ah, I said, smiling, insinuating that I knew of him. We were going to send this one to St. FX. That's where you are, isn't it? I tried to read his face for insinuation, but failed. Didn't you play football yourself? I seem to remember. Hockey. You have a good memory. I actually tried out for Winnipeg when the old WHA was going. I got homesick, though. I'm impressed anybody remembers. How's the coffee? Fine, I said. A healing silence descended for a moment. I presumed his mind was briefly back in Winnipeg. Eventually I said, I'd like to hear as much as you care to tell me. And I want you to understand that this is just for the record. We are in no doubt about the truth of what you've already told us. I want you to understand that. Our only concern is the well-being of your son. And of course, and this is why I want to talk to him, any other possible victims. We have to know the extent of this situation. I knew that the anger was in check for the moment, but that I would have to deal with it again when the time was right, when the tears were ready. Anger is safest when there are tears close by to extinguish it. Okay, he said, and he breathed deeply. Jesus, this is hard. Let's just pray for a moment, privately if you wish. Let's ask for guidance here and justice. In the end, that's what we want. He nodded fervently, lowered his head, and clasped his hands before his face. And in less than a minute, he was sobbing. Thank you.
This book came out a couple of years ago, so I'm a tiny bit sick of it, although it is brilliant and available for sale. So I'm going to read just a little bit from this and then a very short bit, I assure you, from my new book, which is going to be coming out early next year. But I'll start with How Happy to Be. And this book is set in early 2001, which is why some of the pop culture references might seem a little dated. It's a point. And it's about a woman who is working in the bleak, sort of soul-sucking world of celebrity journalism. And she's trying to reconcile this tawdry present with her past, which took place on a commune in BC, and her mother's tragic death. And this little passage takes place in Los Angeles, where she has been sent to cover a press junket for a film that's coming out. And for those of you who are lucky enough not to know what a press junket is, it's when studios pay the way of journalists, fly them to exotic locations, put them up in really nice hotels, ply them with food and liquor, and then have them sit down with celebrities for a few minutes, and then they cross their fingers and hope that they write favorably about their usually pretty bad films. So this is the world in which this character Max is working, and it's wearing on her, to say the least. There are 8 of us around the table. adjusting our tape recorders, quietly testing, although at this particular table, there's a lot of un, deux, trois, and eins, zwei, drei. Map-sized plastic tags dangle from our necks in case we get lost and need to be returned to our home countries. Belgium, Japan, Spain. Otherwise, we're known as Team A. I've been placed at the foreign journalist table by some publicist who finds Canada exotic. It's flattering, in a way. Dinner last night was crap, says Australia, a man who doesn't trust the name tag to fully convey his nationality and has topped off his cliché with a floppy Crocodile Dundee hat. Last year we went to that steak place, and this year it's some Tex-Mex crap. Japan nods. It's more cheap this year, she says. Japan pulls out a Palm Pilot from Eddie Murphy junket. The table moans with envy. Sure, we're bunked out in $400 a night hotel rooms with spine-conforming pillows and baskets of foot softener, but where's the free technological equipment? This movie sucks. So, Team A, I say, do you guys think we should get a mascot or a cheer or something? How about like a viper or a manatee? Team A ignores me. A publicist scurries to the table, a single bead of sweat miraculously balanced on his brow, jutting out like a pea. The producer will be first, followed by the writer, then Miss Aniston, he says. Anyone need anything? Espresso, chai latte? Damn straight, everybody needs something, and when the snacks arrive, the table devours and conquers. Here's the thing. Most entertainment writers earn very little money and even less prestige. These men and women who have been flown here from all around the world live most likely in one-room haciendas, grimy rez-de-chaussee apartments with moldy bathtub grouting, their desk drawers stuffed with thumbed copies of a low magazine and half-completed movie scripts of their own. Something in them wanted this, proximity, if nothing else. The sadder ones, those, are those who truly loved the movies once. They thought they could make a living, best job in the world, writing about movies, and that writing about movies was a way to write about love, dying, laughing. But slowly, they were pushed towards celebrity profiles and diets and dating stories, and these ones have kids to support, alimony to pay. At the next table, there are two, the stooping Spanish man and the shriveled British woman, identifiable by the novels in their laps. So they know what it means to write about celebrity for a living, the wearing down, the dulling, but they do it anyway, and those, I admit, are my favorites, the broken-backed ones. The producer is ushered in, an oily creature in squeaky loafers that warn of his approach. Italy launches the first question. Do you like the movie? Why, yes. The producer loves the movie. Everyone worked together, 110%. It was like a family. Familia, he says, for the benefit of Italy. And this project mattered because no other movie like it has ever been made before. No, nobody on my movie is a diva. I don't turn on my tape recorder or take notes or ask questions, and eventually no one else does either. This is too much of a PR crapathon even for Team A. We sit in silence, staring at the producer's hands, wondering about all those gold rings keeping his fingers from touching. Looking uncomfortable, he signals the publicist and is removed. The publicist returns angry. Listen, you're expected to ask questions. We do keep a list of who's participating, he says. This means we might not be invited back, the same way people who write one too many negative pieces, the actor can never appear, too fat, too stoned, too stupid, aren't invited back, and the same way that no one on a junket writes negative pieces because the editors need the movie companies to advertise, and just thinking about all these unspoken rules. It's too much like the commune, too much unsaid, and I feel it all of a sudden, language, thick and liquid, curling around us, prying at our mouths and pens, trying to get out, and us too cowardly to use it. The screenwriter has a patina of mourning over his skin, eyes encrusted with sleep. According to the press notes, the writer went to Harvard. He answers questions in 3 languages, one of which is Japanese, so let's give him bonus points and call it 3.5. Looking from face to face intently, he describes the film like this. I think that slowly all of us are shying away from intimacy. We're shying away using clever, cynical devices. If you look at films, any truly emotional moment is undercut by a cynical moment right afterwards. I think the way we lead our lives, all of us, is prone to unhappiness because we're taught to want things. We're taught to think we're not complete without something, and unhappiness, like a background drone, pushes us not to feel because what we feel is unhappiness. Australia yawns, adjusts his hat. The Estonia journalist gets up and scampers to the buffet for a muffin. This is my job. Work used to mean digging and building in days dictated by sun and snow. This is some new kind of work, a steady magnetic hum of tape recorders clicking and the electroshock of computer screens. The publicist is the one organic component, huffing and puffing, circling the table, kicking at the carpet with his heel, scribbling the names of non-participants on his clipboard, consulting the stopwatch attached to his wrist. By jolting the audience into a strong emotion you can make them feel, by feeling the unhappiness, we reclaim our humanity, says the screenwriter, rather shrill. I hear myself speaking before any editing instinct takes over. No offense, but this is a romantic comedy about a Manhattan career woman who inherits twin babies when her maid Imelda is deported. Do you really think it's a film about emotional intimacy? The publicist leans close to my name tag and scribbles hard on the clipboard. The writer nods, turns even paler. You should have seen the first draft, he mutters. So that's that. And if you want to know what happens to Jennifer Aniston, you have to buy it. Okay, you can buy it. So this is just this is the first time I'm actually reading this in public. We've been working on it, and it's coming in, I think, early next year. This book is called Everybody Has Everything, and most simply put, it's about a childless couple that inherits a child accidentally. And these are the first couple of pages. In the end, after all those years, it took Anna and James only a few bloody seconds to become parents. James arrived first, stumbling toward a police officer sitting on a chair by a door marked morgue. He felt his eyes ballooning. He tried but could not blink. You're awake, he thought. This is happening. My name is James Ridgmore, he said to the policeman who stood quickly as if caught in the act. James noticed he was short, or shorter than James. My name is James Ridgmore. Just a moment, said the policeman. He went into the room, leaving James in an empty hallway, sniffing at alcohol and something he couldn't identify. Fire, burning hair, it was freezing down here. The second finger in his left hand turned white at the tip. The policeman reappeared, holding open the door. When James entered, the contents of the room dropped away. All that was left was a body covered with a sheet hovering in bottomless space. But no, not space. The tray jutted out of the wall, a matchbox sleeve. James could not tell if the thing upon it was male or female. Other people were there. He would remember that, the chatter, the grocery store dullness of all crowds, uttering words from television shows about coroners and death reports. No voices were lowered. A woman pulled back the sheet. She wore clear rubber gloves that left her wedding band visible. James looked down and recognized Marcus, the checkmark scar beneath his bottom lip. His black hair was matted with tar. Why would that be? Why tar on his face? Who closed his eyes? James ran rapid fire through questions, but thought them silently, his mouth too dry to speak. Why does he look so different? Can it only be the difference between the living and the dead? Then he realized that the difference, the strangeness, came down to something simple. Marcus was almost always smiling. James had never seen his lips so straight. There was no peace about him, no angel in repose, no release, no calm. He looked agitated, unsettled, as if he had just been annoyed by a telemarketer. Yes, it's him, said James, though no one had asked a question. His legs felt hollow, swirling with smoke, but he did not feel ill. He was not repulsed or disgusted. He did not find it hard to look upon. Then the door slid back into its cabinet and was sealed with a heavy handle. Out of nowhere, the dark-haired woman smiled at him almost ruefully. On his way upstairs in the elevator, she stayed with him. She removed her rubber gloves, stared straight ahead. She was tiny. Everyone seemed small that day. You have a strange job, James told her. She nodded peckishly. You're so little. How do you lift the bodies? Is it hard? Then there was a roaring in his ears, the sound of steel twisting. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, sensed a stream of sound pour forth from the coroner's mouth. He couldn't distinguish one word from the next. The elevator stopped, and the tiny woman put her hand under his elbow. She guided him out on his empty legs, past green walls, his feet on different colored footprints stenciled on the floor. She appeared to be following the purple footprints, and so James did too, pulled along as if he were on a skateboard, past elevators, around corners. At first, there were a few patients walking here and there, someone with his papery ass hanging out in the open air, pushing an IV. But as the other colored footprints disappeared, the corridors grew quieter, more deserted. Though he knew it already, James was now reminded that what was coming next was serious. Not as serious as the basement, as Marcus, frozen in a drawer, but serious. At room 5117, they stopped before a closed door. The woman propped James up against the wall and entered the room alone, a bellhop, doing one last pass to make sure everything was in place before opening the door to the guest. When the door opened for him at last, James saw a body on the bed. Cleaner than Marcus, its face bloated, tubes trailed from the fingers up the chest, white bandages soaked with deep brown circles covered the head. The eyes, too, were closed, but the sound of the machines clapping and whirring was like a language like the body was announcing itself to this room, singing its name, Sarah. This room, James glanced around at all the people who emerged then slowly in full relief. A male nurse cradling a bundle of sheets in his arms. Out of the sheets, dangling in the air, was a foot, encased in a small white running shoe. James moved then, fast towards the sheets, which were not sheets at all, but a boy, and not a boy, but Finn, Marcus and Sarah's Finn. It was the longest walk James had ever taken, those 6 steps through a room of strangers, his arms out, his body trembling. "Give him to me," he whispered. Angry at the time between the now and the boy he needed to put to his chest, angry that no one had given him over sooner. He grabbed the bundle still warm, and oh my God, something happened that was not of this earth, was transporting undenied. The bundle shook to life, let loose a howl never heard before from a place in him of all-knowing, of the minds beneath the beneath, a sound of despair that moved like a boulder over James. He held the boy closer, the boy who would soon be too big for this kind of holding. His legs dangling from James's torso, only one sneaker, one dirty sock, as if he had been running. The sticky black tar on him too, which was not tar, James recognized finally, but blood. Blood in Finn's blonde hair that James was weeping into, keening along with him, but holding on, holding him, the unbreakable, undroppable boy. Thank you for indulging me.
Before I begin, I have an apology to make. I would say in the past hour and a half, I've actually caused some damage to Canadian literature. I'm guessing that in the past hour and a half, this is measurable damage that I've done. It may crop up in people's lives in the next week or so. In the past hour and a half, I suspect I have infected 5 of the most influential writers in Canada with a terrible cough and cold. It's a terrible thing. I'm sorry, guys. But it's kind of fun. It's like those fantasies terrorists have of dropping one bomb on the Pentagon, you know? So, excuse my cough. Girl Crazy is a novel about... it's funny, there have been several books intervening with How Insensitive, and there are a lot of similarities with this character and that first character. This guy also studied literature and is now teaching in a community college in the suburbs of Toronto. His name's Justin. And he's teaching, but he's not teaching literature, of course. He's teaching business English and online communications and introduction to media. To people who are actually in the forestry or hospitality program, and he had he's just broken up with his girlfriend. His girlfriend Genevieve dumped him because he wasn't ambitious enough and wasn't getting out of this life to go into something more productive like marketing and PR, which is what Genevieve does. And a strange thing happened to Justin just the weekend before. He helped a very rough-looking but sexy girl who was in trouble and needed an ambulance, and he helped her get medical attention, and he's wondering if she's going to call him. And this is his first day back at work after this encounter with this girl back at Constitution College Polytechnical Institute. And he's with his colleague Meredith. Justin and Meredith hauled their respective bags down the corridor to 102. There were no windows in 102. It had once been an office, but now had to serve as a meeting room or small seminar room, with one table and chairs around it. There was no blackboard, but one of those big paper tablets on a tripod, on which Mike, he's their boss, the head of the department, liked to scrawl out his flow charts. Management, arrow. Creativity, arrow. End user. And his motivational messages, access equals education equals productivity. And sitting at the end of the table right beside the paper tablet as if she were already itching to scrawl circles and arrows on it herself was Annette, the PR idiot. This was a really very bad sign. She had her steel gray power suit on and her briefcase at her side. Her blouse was gray silk. Her hair was striped with blonde in a style Justin would once have called frosted, although he didn't know if that's what it was still called. It was probably blonde to hide gray, although it wasn't exactly clear how old she was. She could be between 35 and 45, could be 50. Justin was not good at these estimations. She did have quite large breasts, though, and was not afraid of bearing an edge of lace camisole in the gap between her lapels. Annette smiled brightly at the two teachers, and they slumped into seats like prisoners before the parole board. If Annette was here at the departmental level at this crucial stage in the college's fundraising campaign, it meant that there was something wrong with their department. You did not want the attention of PR people at the best of times, and this was a time at which PR people were all quite stressed. This was going to be, then, a meeting at which they would likely hear the word optics, and brand, and possibly awareness, and maybe even grassroots level. He and Meredith waited, their heads bowed. There was only one thing that Justin wanted out of this meeting, and it was to raise again the possibility of expanding his course load to include a class remotely related to what he was trained to teach, possibly even something literary, even though it was well known to all that Meredith had always had and always would have exclusive rights to the sole actual literature class taught in the entire Department of Media and Communications. This course was called The Fiction of Betrayal, and she had taught it every year for the past 12 years, since the year of her divorce, in fact. The presence of Annette, the PR idiot, was bad news for Justin's expectations of a discussion of literature. The other teachers were filing in and scraping the metal chairs around the table. Linden Nelman had had her hair cropped especially short over the weekend. Her plastic-framed spectacles seemed even more absurdly oversized on her bumpy little head. Joe Montalino looked dapper in his gray beard and black sports shirt. He was always smiling. Justin suspected this was because he was always a little drunk. Justin was okay with that. He liked Joe Montalino. Two more Mikes, known as Mike B and Michael M, arrived next. They were young guys who had English degrees like Justin. They stayed pretty quiet. They knew their place. They waited for Mike, the chair. Mike made sure he was always last, and he was the only one to be called Mike, just Mike. The others were Mike B and Michael M. You got this quickly. You didn't think about these things after a while. Mike always came in shouting, "Hello, hello, hello, people. How's the team this morning?" Nobody answered him, except, of course, Annette, the PR idiot, who said, "Just great, thank you." Mike was already uncapping a marker, folding over a new clean sheet on the big noteboard. He checked the pager on his belt, then the portable email device on the other side. "Okay," he said. "Won't keep you all for long. There's some routine business to get to before we talk about the big issue, which is the provincial testing issue, and Annette is here to help us with some optics considerations with that." Mike was hardly older than Justin, maybe 2 or 3 years, but where Justin had wasted his early and mid-20s on Renaissance drama, Mike had had the good sense to go into advertising, and Mike let you know that. He was bigger than you and richer than you, and he had a crisp blue shirt and sharp dress slacks and a bunch of communications devices strapped to his belt like Batman, and he was your boss. "So," said Mike, his hands on his hips, "I understand people are not happy with their parking spaces." There was a chuckle around the table. "Parking space," said Joe Montalino. "Who has a parking space?" Mike said, "With the parking space situation, listen, it's very simple. There are 4 parking spaces for the department, and those spaces are assigned first to administrative staff, so the first 2 go to Janice and Erna in the office. Third one goes to me." Mike folded his arms across his chest. "And the 4th is assigned on the basis of seniority." "I thought we're an autonomous collective," said Justin. Nobody laughed. "Which means that Meredith," said Mike, "as our senior instructor, is entitled to it. But as you know, since Meredith doesn't drive," Joe Montalino said, "nobody gets it." "Mike," said Annette, the PR idiot, "could I make a special request?" She was smiling at him like a spotlight. "I wonder if we could change slightly the order of the agenda for this morning, just because I'm due in the principal's office in 15 minutes. I wonder if we could get to the initiative question, and then I'll let you guys get on with it." "Right, okay. Here's the thing. Province-wide testing happens next spring. There'll be a special session at the end of this term for the students in the summer programs who happen to be graduating this fall. That means that anyone in your classes right now..." While Mike spoke, Justin drew in his notebook. He drew a flower, which metamorphosed into a giant communications tower. Then he drew an ambulance with a big flashing red light on top. He leafed through the previous pages in his notebook, and he saw that many of his doodles had involved the name Genevieve. He put a line through as many of these as he could find. "Results," Mike was saying, "are what is going to enable this department to survive. Anyone who is not interested in results is not going to make it in this environment. If anyone's wondering how I got to where I am, standing in front of you here today..." "Mike," said Meredith Solberg Spencer, "when you say results, you mean solely those results that are measured by the provincial tests, am I correct?" He said, "You are correct. In today's environment..." She said, "So you mean you're not interested in any other means of measuring results?" "Such as," said Mike, checking his watch. She said, "Such as literacy, such as understanding, such as having greater communication skills, such as having a better chance at getting a job." Such as knowledge, said Linden Nelman mournfully. Mike looked over at Annette, and the two of them smiled at each other. Mike shook his head apologetically. And how, said Mike, holding out his hands, how exactly do we measure results like that? Well, exactly, said Meredith. Exactly my point, said Mike. He turned back to his noteboard. Now, let's try to stay on track here. There was some sighing around the table, so Mike turned back around and laid his marker down. Listen, he said. He sat on the edge of the table. He was going to come down to their level now. He was going to listen to their problems. He said, I know a lot of you feel that we should be training our students to become failed novelists. He stared at Meredith here. She dropped her head. And there's certainly room for a little of that. Probably makes them more sensitive or something. I don't know, like a good mind exercise, an exercise for the mind. But I wonder if any of you here have ever had the experience of getting a new product, say a DVD player, and trying to install it and read the manual and having a little trouble reading the manual. Anyone here had that happen to them? I'm curious. Mike smiled at Annette. Everyone around the table had taken out notebooks and begun to draw. Justin drew a series of breast-like blobs. He couldn't make them too lifelike or they would be recognizable. He really wanted to draw nipples on them, but he was sitting right next to Linden Nelman. When the blobs began to look too bulbously breast-like, he turned them into raindrops. Why is it, I wonder, said Mike, that all technical manuals are so badly written, and I wonder why we aren't a little more concerned about that. I mean, that is a problem we can all solve. If we are the teachers of the writers of technical manuals, and no one can read those technical manuals, then we are directly to blame, and I think that's a whole lot more of a pressing problem than turning out another generation of failed novelists. There was a silence, and Mike turned back to the board. But Meredith said, so instead we're training them to be failed technical writers? Mike swung around. Why would they fail? She said, because there simply aren't very many technical writing jobs. They can't all get them. He said, well, all right, if you want to be literal about every... Linda Nelman said, wouldn't it be more useful to teach them how to write than to teach them how to answer these multiple choice tests about writing? Okay, said Mike. Now, listen. He rubbed his face with his hands as if immensely tired and sat on the desk again. He shook his head sadly. I know some of you would like to go back to a system where people who went to really good schools, like most of you, get to succeed in life, and others don't. Oh, Mike, said Meredith, don't be ridiculous. That's not at all. All I'm saying, said Mike, holding up the large flat palm again like a traffic warden, all I'm saying is that we can get a little bit romantic about what we're doing here. Tell me if I'm wrong, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, please. I'd be glad to hear it. But tell me, is our first job here to help people? Mike, or isn't it? I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. Would you agree that our first job here is to help people? There was more sighing around the table. Linda Nelman dropped her pen with a flick of her fingers. All right then, if our job is to help people, to give them a head start in life, how do we do that? We know that we service a lot of underprivileged areas here, a lot of new citizens. If we rely solely on this idea of, I don't know what you call it, unbridled merit or whatever you want to believe in, then the kids who've gone to private schools and public schools in wealthy areas have unfair advantages. Maybe you guys don't know anything about that. He sat up, folded his arms across his chest, and frowned at them. Let's be realistic here. We all know that our primary purpose is to help these kids get a start, get in the door. We know that once you have a job, you learn to do it. There's very little specific training you can give for all jobs. They're all different. We all know it, honestly, really. It's not really an education that helps you do well in the world. If it was, wouldn't all you guys be millionaires? He threw his head back and barked a laugh. Well, he got a few smiles for this one. There was going to be no more arguing. It was not easy to argue with Mike from this point on. Nope. What helps you do well in the world is a skill at a particular job, and you learn on the job. Now, he opened his eyes wide, held a finger in the air. How are you going to do that if you don't have a foot in the door? Hey, we provide that foot in the door, right? And how do we do that? What's the one thing these kids need? It's some kind of qualification. Am I right? They need one post-secondary diploma or qualification. It's going to change their lives. Why would we make getting that thing more difficult for them? Because we don't want them to have the advantages we had, or some of us had anyway. Hey? He coughed, looked at his watch, waited for objections. The instructors drew on their notepads. All right, now since Annette has to go, let's get back to the issues of the standardized testing. This department has a whole lot to contribute to the image of the college in terms of the results that we can guarantee. And that's particularly important right now in the middle of this major fundraising drive. The capital initiative said Annette quickly. The capital initiative. And this department is really going to stand or fall on the basis of the results that we can guarantee. There's some people going to make it, and some who don't. Justin drew blobs as fast as he could. It was clear at this point that this meeting was not going to permit at any point a discussion of any change in workload or the proposal of a new class on any kind of literature other than the fiction of betrayal. He'd have to corner Mike on one-on-one sometime. Then Annette got up to make her presentation, and Justin was at least distracted for a moment by the back of her trousers as she wrote her key points on the noteboard. The trousers were quite tight and quite thin, as women's suits were, and there was the distinct outline of a thong in the small of her back. This impressed Justin, as she was quite old for sex. It even made him consider, for the briefest of seconds, listening to what she had to say.
In my latest novel, the protagonist and narrator, Eileen Ward, is a housekeeper in a country home in Oxfordshire. And the year is 1658. And Eileen, now in her 70th year, feels the need to reveal the great secret that has shaped her life, namely that she is the illegitimate daughter of England's most famous playwright, William Shakespeare. Over the next several months, Eileen will relate to Charlotte, the young mistress of the house, how, as a young woman, Eileen's mother was spurned by the local village for her sexual waywardness, and so set out for London, where she met a young actor at the beginning of his career in the theatre. She will then tell of how she became pregnant by him and of how she was forced to return to the village that had rejected her, to live once again in the home of her brother and her reproachful sister-in-law. 2 years later, after a fire destroys her uncle's business, Eileen herself will go to London in search of her father. Tonight I'm going to read a brief passage from early in the book in which Eileen describes her childhood living with her unwell mother, enduring the disgrace of being a base-born child. In those early years, Mam was not direct with me and would often say one thing and then another. My father had been a soldier, but was killed fighting the Spanish, who were threatening the Queen's realm. How I liked the sound of that phrase, the Queen's realm. I had no idea where Mam found it, most likely from a storybook, for it didn't sound in the least like her. Then some weeks later I would ask again, and she would have forgotten the story about the soldier and launch a tale in which my father was a seaman who would sail with Drake against the Armada in the very year I was born, and had died later in a shipwreck off the Canaries. Making up stories was of a piece with Mam's oddness. As I would learn in time, she was seen by others not only as an unwed mother who sewed in her brother's shop, but also as a woman who kept to herself. Mam believed in all manner of fanciful things, imps and fairies, changelings and hobgoblins. As a child, I would watch her tap a forefinger 3 times against the side of her nose at the sight of a pied-colored horse, or upon hearing the first clap of thunder from an oncoming storm. Not that unusual among country people, you might think, but with Mam it was like a religion, a way of seeing into the world. At the same time, she was a believing Christian, but she could not resist the enchantment she found in the natural world. Walking in the woods and meadows on the edge of the village, she talked sometimes to birds and hedgehogs, voles and conies. She sought the whereabouts of the little people near the roots of oak trees and under toadstools. In all its phases, the moon was both everlasting mystery and companion. When I was very young and walked along beside her, I myself thought these things quite wondrous and asked endless questions about the pixies and fairy folk. But as I grew older, I began to see it all as nonsense. Yet Mam persisted in believing in the efficacy of spells and magic, and she was conversant about trees and flowers. It is little wonder that she loved A Midsummer Night's Dream and had me read it to her 6 times during the final year of her life. She told me that the 6th reading was a good omen, 6 being the double of 3, which itself, she said, is a number possessed of magical properties. I was 12 years old then. As she said, 12 is the double of 6, another good sign that she might recover. But nothing, neither simples nor signs, could change her wasting away that awful year. I have an image of my mother, which I will carry to my own deathbed. I could not have been 4 years old, and she had taken me with her to visit Goody Figs, an old woman who lived in a hut in the woods near the river, where she drew water each day for her potions. I was frightened of her, and on my only visit stood in the doorway of her dark little home, peering in at the plants and herbs hanging from the rafters, the small fire in the grate, the hides of animals drying on benches. I would go no farther, and Ma'am could not persuade me otherwise. But she was fascinated by Goody Figs, and on the day I went with her, I played alone and watched them together on the edge of a wood, gathering simples, a pretty woman and an old hag. I remember my mother raising and rising from the grass now and then to stretch her back, and holding her hand to shield her eyes against the sunlight as she looked for me. Then she would wave, and I would wave back. A warm-hearted creature, Ma'am, but innocent in the ways of the world and far too trusting. She called me Erline, a name no one in the village, including my aunt and uncle, had ever heard. Ma'am told me she got the name from an old book of Anglo-Saxon tales, which she had read as a child. Erline means elf-like, and she called me so because at birth I was early and small, with a large head covered with dark black hair. You reminded me of a little elf as soon as I saw you, she said. Apparently my birth had been more than the usual ordeal for new mothers. What a time I had bringing you into this world, Ma'am used to say, and more than once, especially when she was vexed with me. That head of yours nearly tore me apart. I could have perished from the pain, as if it were my fault. She told this story so many times that I grew weary of it and said to her once, I might have been 6 at the time, I don't know why you bother to put little in front of elf. Are not all elves little by their very nature? Oh, she said, haven't we become a smarty boots? And what if I have, I said, have you not made me so with words and reading? She laughed at that, for she was never angry long. Ma'am herself seldom read anything. She merely encouraged it in me because she thought I was plain and unlikely to find a mate. When she first taught me my letters, she was quick to tell me why. You will never be a beauty, little elf, she said, and so you must learn, and reading books will help you. What a thing to say to a child, and I thought as much even then. Like many handsome people, Ma'am lacked discernment regarding the feelings of those less favored by nature in appearance. And of course, she had long forgotten my little lesson in redundancy. But it is true that my head is large and my brow imposing, which some claim betokens intelligence. When I was in my 15th year and first laid eyes upon my father in Silver Street in London, I took note at once of the brow I had inherited, though in fairness I must say that it suited a grown man's countenance better than a young girl's. As a child I was often mocked, not only for being a bastard, but also for my appearance. But I soon learned to give as good as I received. When other children out of spite hurled stones at me, I sprayed them with words I found in little books Aunt Sarah bought from peddlers, with titles such as News Out of Heaven, A Potation for Lent, The Sick Man's Salve. Words were my weapons, and they sometimes discouraged jeering. Children called me Little Miss Big Tongue. At the beginning of my 12th year, Ma'am promised to unfold the truth about my father, but said I must wait for my birthday, for by then I would be old enough to understand. An entire year, I thought. How cruel. And I think I must have sulked a good deal in the ensuing months. I had always been an inward-looking child, interested only in words on a page, though by then I was tired of reading accounts of Protestants roasted to death by Queen Mary's papists, or tracts promoting wholesome habits that would ensure an afterlife. So my sulking and ill humor that year often led to encounters with Aunt Sarah, who had always despaired of my salvation, and these led to thrashings, mostly when Mam was away at my uncle's shop. I never mentioned them to her, and I took particular pride in enduring those leather strap beatings without tears. I was a hard little nut to crack, and no mistake. At the same time, I was worried about my mother, and that may have contributed to my surliness. There was something wrong with her that summer. It was not easily discernible. You had to look for it. And I was looking for it, observing with the passing weeks a thinning out of color in her face, a sharpening of her features. One morning on her way to work, she suddenly fell to the ground in a faint. There on the flagstone pathway from the front door, I saw the collapse, her head narrowly missing a stone when she fell. Uncle Jack carried her indoors and upstairs to bed. She soon recovered and made a fuss about not wanting a doctor, laughing away her clumsiness. Then, a fortnight before my 12th birthday, a Saturday in July, Mam returned with Uncle Jack from Oxford. It was my uncle's habit to visit Oxford Market every other Saturday to inspect the linen goods on display and enjoy the gossip of his trade with fellow vendors. He always took Mam along. He saw it, I suppose, as an outing for his sister. While my uncle had a pint of ale with friends in the Hounds and Hare, Mam was free to roam about, perhaps attending to an errand for my aunt or looking for a trinket for me. On her return that Saturday, however, her gaunt face was flushed. She seemed agitated, but pleasantly so, and eagerly drawing me aside, she whispered that we should go to the stone bench in the garden, where we talked often together, safely out of Aunt Sarah's hearing. There she told me about wandering in Oxford Market and happening upon the bookstalls, and what did I think she saw there? I told her perhaps a storybook that might please me, but she only smiled and took my hands and briefly held them. Your 12th birthday is only a fortnight off, she said, so there is no good reason now to wait, for truly I cannot keep this to myself another minute. And with that she withdrew from beneath her apron a copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. I read those very words in the title page. A storybook then, I asked, or poems? A playbook, said Mam, already enacted in the London Playhouse. The bookseller told me it's only lately printed, and this play was written by your father, Erling. I believe that at the time I was as puzzled as I was pleased. But how would you come to know a man who writes plays, I asked. He was only young when I knew him, Mam said, an apprentice player living in London in a place called Shoreditch, a country person like myself. He always said he wanted to write poetry. I will tell you how we came to meet in good time. But look now, I have another by him. And she showed me a copy of Romeo and Juliet. But his name is not on this. I said, how do you know he wrote it? The bookseller told me, she said, a kind man and a great reader of poetry by the sound of it. He told me this Romeo and Juliet is a good tale, a sad one, with fine verses in it. Mr. Shakespeare, he said, has written many plays. The bookseller hasn't seen them performed on the stage, but he has read them, and he said I would enjoy this Romeo and Juliet as well as A Midsummer Night's Dream because Mr. Shakespeare is now accounted the finest playwright in London. His plays, he believed, have even been performed before the Queen. I got both plays for 10pence, for the Romeo and Juliet has been used, but A Midsummer Night's Dream is new. I scanned it at the bookstall. It takes place in a forest with fairy folk and lovers and fine descriptions of flowers. We used to talk about the countryside, your father and I. He was homesick for it then, poor fellow, and now a gentleman and poet. I am so happy for him. Calm yourself, ma'am, I said. Your face is on fire. Well, what of that, she said, squeezing my hand. This is your father's work, Erling. Your father was no idle porter, no, nor ploughman neither, though many hereabouts believe so. And drawing near, she said, but listen to me, child. These books must be our secret. If your aunt finds out, there'll be the devil to pay, for she accounts such books wicked, and she will not have them in her house. In London, I recall your father saying how the Puritans were always trying to close down the playhouses. He used to make sport of their long faces and somber dress. My father, a poet and a gentleman, was that not worth waiting for all those years? I wanted to know more about him, but Ma'am said, I'm tired, Arlene. All that traipsing about this morning and now this news. I should lie down for a bit. We'll read these plays, you and I. I like the sound of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and you can read the other. And then we'll exchange. I know you'll read yours half again as fast as I will mine, so be patient with me and keep your copy well hidden from your aunt. You must promise me. And so I have done until now, some 58 years. Thank you.